They thought they were having private board meetings to discuss how to get rid of my emotional support animal. What they didn't know was that I'd been recording every illegal discussion for 6 months. But when the State Attorney General's office reviewed 180 hours of secret footage, Janet Mills discovered that trying to circumvent federal disability law was the least of her legal problems. This is the story of how one HOA president's obsession with control led to the biggest sunshine law violation in Colorado history, and how a veteran's cybersecurity skills turned 6 months of patience into the most satisfying legal takedown you've ever seen. If you think HOA drama can't get any more dramatic than this, wait until you see what happens when federal agents start knocking on doors. Let me introduce you to my family. I'm Marcus Thompson, 38 years old, and I spent 8 years in the Army, including 2 tours in Iraq. Those experiences left me with PTSD that I manage daily, but I'm not defined by it. After my service, I built a career in cybersecurity, specializing in surveillance systems and digital evidence collection. It's ironic how skills you learn to protect people overseas end up protecting you at home. Rex is my 4-year-old golden retriever mix and the most important member of our household. He's not just a pet, he's my emotional support animal, prescribed by Dr. Patricia Woods after a particularly difficult period following my discharge. Rex has this incredible ability to sense when my anxiety is spiking or when nightmares are about to hit. He'll place his head on my chest, apply gentle pressure, and somehow bring me back to the present moment. The difference Rex made in my life was immediate and profound. Before him, crowded spaces triggered panic attacks. Loud noises sent me into hypervigilance mode. Sleep was a battlefield where memories fought with exhaustion every night. Rex changed all of that. He became my anchor to reality, my early warning system, and my constant reminder that I was safe. When we moved to Sunset Valley Estates 18 months ago, it felt like we'd found the perfect place to build a quiet life. The community was advertised as veteran-friendly, with wide streets, peaceful common areas, and a neighborhood association focused on maintaining property values while respecting residents' privacy. Rex loved the walking trails, and I appreciated the security and stability after years of constant movement. The HOA seemed reasonable at first. Monthly fees were fair, common area maintenance was excellent, and the board meetings I attended were professional and focused on actual community issues like landscaping contracts and speed limit enforcement. I introduced myself to neighbors, explained Rex's role as my emotional support animal, and showed them his official documentation from Dr. Woods. Everyone seemed understanding and welcoming. Then Janet Mills ran for HOA president. Janet was 54 years old, recently divorced, and apparently looking for something to control after losing authority over her ex-husband. She campaigned on a platform of restoring community standards and eliminating loopholes that allow certain residents to ignore rules. Her campaign materials featured photos of perfectly manicured lawns and promises to crack down on violations that previous boards had allegedly ignored. Janet won the election by 3 votes, primarily because most residents didn't bother voting in HOA elections. Within 2 weeks of taking office, she'd implemented new inspection protocols, hired a property management company to enforce violations, and scheduled weekly board meetings instead of the previous monthly schedule. The first sign of trouble came when Janet started what she called compliance walks through the neighborhood. These weren't casual strolls, they were systematic inspections where she photographed everything from mailbox positions to lawn edging angles. She carried a clipboard, a measuring tape, and a camera, documenting perceived violations with the intensity of a crime scene investigator. I first met Janet during one of these walks when she stopped in front of my house and began photographing Rex, who was lying peacefully on our front porch. When I approached to introduce myself, her demeanor was immediately hostile. "I don't recall approving any pets in this community," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. The CC and RS clearly state that animals must be registered with the board and comply with size and breed restrictions. I politely explained that Rex was an emotional support animal, protected under federal fair housing laws, and therefore exempt from pet restrictions. I offered to show her Rex's documentation from Dr. Woods, along with the Fair Housing Act provisions that protected our rights. Janet's expression shifted from suspicious to openly hostile. "Everyone thinks they can get around community standards with some fake emotional support animal," she said. "I've seen this scam before. People buy certificates online and claim their pets are service animals to avoid pet fees and restrictions." I stayed calm and explained the difference between service animals and emotional support animals, the legitimate medical process for ESA prescriptions, and the federal protections that apply to our situation. Janet listened with obvious skepticism, taking notes and photos throughout our conversation. "We'll see about that," she said before walking away. The board will be reviewing all claimed exemptions to ensure they're legitimate and not just attempts to circumvent community standards. 3 days later, I received my first violation notice. Rex was cited for being an unregistered pet in violation of community animal restrictions. The notice demanded that I either register Rex as a standard pet, pay a $500 pet deposit plus $75 monthly pet fees, or remove him from the property within 30 days. I immediately responded with a formal letter explaining ESA protections under the Fair Housing Act, including copies of Rex's documentation and relevant federal statutes. I sent it certified mail to ensure Janet couldn't claim she never received it. Her response came within a week, and it was even more aggressive than her first notice. Janet claimed that emotional support animals weren't protected under community association rules, that federal housing laws didn't apply to HOAs, and that I needed to provide additional documentation proving Rex's medical necessity. She demanded veterinary records, training certifications, and a letter from a board-certified psychiatrist confirming my disability. None of these requirements were legally valid. ESAs don't need special training, veterinary records aren't required for housing accommodations, and demanding specific types of medical professionals violates privacy laws. Janet was either completely ignorant of federal disability rights or deliberately trying to intimidate me into compliance. That's when I decided to start paying closer attention to Janet's activities. My cybersecurity background taught me the value of documentation and evidence collection. When dealing with potentially hostile actors, you need to understand their methods, motivations, and vulnerabilities. I began researching Janet's history, the HOA's governance structure, and Colorado's sunshine laws governing community associations. What I discovered was troubling. Janet had been involved in similar disputes at her previous community in Denver, where she'd served on the board before moving to Sunset Valley. Online forums contained complaints about her aggressive enforcement tactics and allegations that she'd targeted specific residents for harassment. More concerning was her approach to board governance. Colorado's Common Interest Community Act requires that all board meetings be open to homeowners, with proper notice and opportunities for resident input. But Janet had been scheduling frequent, emergency meetings with minimal notice and conducting executive sessions that excluded residents from discussions about enforcement actions. I started attending these meetings and documenting Janet's behavior. She would frequently discuss specific violations and enforcement strategies in open sessions, potentially violating residents' privacy rights. She made decisions without proper votes and often ignored board members who disagreed with her positions. But the real red flag came when I overheard Janet talking to another board member after a meeting. She mentioned having private discussions about problem residents and planning enforcement strategies without the full board's knowledge. These private discussions, if they involved HOA business, would violate Colorado's sunshine laws requiring open meetings for all community association governance. That's when I decided to install my insurance policy. During my military service and cybersecurity career, I'd learned that the best defense against abuse of power is documentation. If Janet was conducting illegal closed meetings to plan discriminatory enforcement actions, I needed evidence that would stand up in court. I researched Colorado's recording laws and discovered that the state has one-party consent, meaning I could legally record conversations where I was present or had permission to be. The HOA meeting room was community property that I had a right to access as a homeowner, and installing recording equipment for personal security purposes was within my rights as long as I wasn't violating anyone's reasonable expectation of privacy in a public meeting space. I purchased several small, high-quality recording devices designed for surveillance and security applications. These weren't spy gadgets for movies, they were professional-grade equipment used by security companies and law enforcement. The cameras were motion-activated, stored footage locally, and could operate for weeks without maintenance. Installing them required careful planning. The meeting room was used for other community activities, so I needed devices that wouldn't be discovered during normal use. I chose locations that provided clear audio and video coverage of the entire room while remaining invisible to casual observation. The installation took place on a Saturday morning when the clubhouse was being cleaned. I volunteered to help with maintenance, which gave me legitimate access to the meeting room. Within an hour, I had 3 recording devices positioned to capture every conversation and meeting that took place in that space. Then I waited. The first recording session came the following Tuesday when Janet called an emergency executive session to discuss what she termed ongoing compliance issues. According to the notice, this was a closed meeting to discuss legal strategies, which would normally be allowed under sunshine law exceptions for attorney-client privilege. But when I reviewed the footage, there was no attorney present. Instead, Janet and two board members spent 90 minutes discussing specific residents they wanted to target for violations, including detailed plans for how to circumvent federal disability protections for emotional support animals. Janet's voice was crystal clear on the recording. We need to make life difficult enough for these people that they choose to leave on their own. The law says we can't discriminate based on disabilities, but it doesn't say we can't enforce every other rule to the letter. If we find them enough for other violations, they'll eventually give up and move somewhere else. Board member Steve agreed enthusiastically. What about requiring additional medical documentation? We could demand updated letters every 6 months, or require specific types of doctors. Most people won't go through the hassle. Exactly, Janet replied. And if they don't comply with our documentation requests, we can claim they're no longer eligible for accommodations. The key is making it look like legitimate rule enforcement, not discrimination. This was direct evidence of conspiracy to violate federal disability rights. They weren't just ignorant of the law, they were deliberately planning to circumvent it through harassment and illegal documentation requirements. But that was just the beginning. Over the next 6 months, my cameras recorded 15 illegal closed meetings where Janet and her allies planned enforcement strategies targeting specific residents. They discussed ways to selectively enforce rules against people they wanted to remove from the community. They planned coordinated violation campaigns against homeowners who had complained about their governance methods. Most damaging were their discussions about using HOA funds for personal benefits. Janet had arranged for her brother's landscaping company to receive community contracts without competitive bidding. She'd approved expensive common area improvements that primarily benefited properties near her own home. Board member Steve's wife had been hired as a property manager at double the market rate for similar services. But the smoking gun came during a meeting in month 4 of my surveillance operation. Janet and Steve were discussing their Marcus problem and planning what they called a final solution for removing me and Rex from the community. The ESA documentation looks legitimate, Steve admitted. His doctor is board certified, the letter meets all legal requirements, and our attorney says we can't challenge it directly. Janet wasn't deterred. Then we go around it. We document every possible violation we can find. Garbage cans out too early, lawn height variations, mailbox positioning, anything. We fine him constantly until he either pays thousands in penalties or gives up and moves. What if he complains or tries to fight back? He's a veteran with PTSD, Janet said with obvious contempt. These people are unstable and prone to outbursts. If we pressure him enough, he'll eventually lose his temper and do something that gives us grounds for emergency removal. Then we can claim he's a danger to the community. The callousness was breathtaking. Janet was planning to deliberately trigger PTSD symptoms in a disabled veteran, hoping to provoke a reaction she could use to justify eviction. This wasn't just illegal discrimination, it was calculated psychological abuse designed to exploit a recognized disability. That's when I knew it was time to take action. I had 180 hours of recorded evidence showing systematic Sunshine Law violations, conspiracy to commit federal disability discrimination, misuse of community funds, and deliberate targeting of a disabled veteran. Janet thought she was conducting private meetings to plan my harassment, but she'd actually been confessing to multiple felonies on camera for 6 months. The question wasn't whether I had enough evidence to destroy Janet's scheme. The question was which law enforcement agency would be most interested in prosecuting the biggest community association fraud case in Colorado history. I made copies of everything and began reaching out to the appropriate authorities. This wasn't going to be a simple HOA dispute resolved through community mediation. This was going to be a federal civil rights case with criminal implications for everyone involved. Rex had no idea that his peaceful afternoon naps on the porch had triggered the most comprehensive surveillance operation in HOA history. But he was about to become the most protected emotional support animal in the state of Colorado. Janet Mills was about to learn that targeting a cybersecurity expert's emotional support animal was the biggest mistake of her life. Monday morning, I walked into the Colorado Attorney General's Civil Rights Division carrying 6 months of evidence that would end Janet Mills' reign of terror and send shockwaves through every HOA in the state. The receptionist took one look at my briefcase full of documentation and immediately called Senior Investigator Maria Santos, who specialized in disability discrimination cases. "Mr. Thompson," Santos said after reviewing my initial complaint, "these are serious allegations. Conspiracy to violate federal disability rights can result in criminal charges, not just civil penalties. Are you prepared for the level of scrutiny this investigation will bring to your community?" I handed her the first USB drive containing 180 hours of recorded evidence. "Ma'am, I've been documenting systematic civil rights violations for 6 months. Every conversation is time-stamped, every participant is identified, and every illegal action is clearly recorded. Janet Mills and her board haven't just violated sunshine laws, they've conspired to commit federal crimes." Santos plugged in the drive and began reviewing the footage. Her expression shifted from professional skepticism to genuine shock as she watched Janet openly discussing plans to circumvent federal disability protections. When she reached the recording where Janet called veterans with PTSD unstable and prone to outbursts, Santos stopped the playback and looked directly at me. "Mr. Thompson, this is evidence of deliberate targeting based on disability status. This isn't just discrimination, it's conspiracy to commit hate crimes under federal civil rights statutes. We're going to need to involve the FBI Civil Rights Division immediately." While Santos was making federal phone calls, I was implementing phase 2 of my plan. I'd already contacted the Colorado Division of Real Estate, which oversees community association governance, and the IRS, which needed to know about Janet's misuse of HOA funds for personal benefit. But the real nuclear option was my complaint to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. HUD takes disability discrimination in housing extremely seriously, and they have the authority to impose penalties that can bankrupt community associations and personally liability board members. Tuesday brought Janet's predictable escalation. She'd apparently decided that my refusal to back down meant it was time for the nuclear option. I received a certified letter demanding Rex's immediate removal based on what she claimed were credible reports of aggressive behavior toward community residents. The letter was a masterpiece of fabricated evidence. According to Janet, multiple neighbors had complained about Rex charging at children, displaying aggressive posturing, and creating an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. She'd even included a timeline of alleged incidents, complete with dates, times, and witness statements. There was just one problem. Every single incident was fictional. I had security cameras around my property that provided 24/7 coverage of everywhere Rex spent time. On the dates Janet claimed Rex was terrorizing the neighborhood, the footage showed him sleeping on the porch, playing fetch in our backyard, or walking calmly on leash during our evening routine. Janet had made her biggest mistake yet. By filing false reports about a disabled veteran's emotional support animal, she'd committed federal perjury in addition to her existing civil rights violations. She'd also given me the perfect opportunity to reveal my surveillance evidence in a way that would maximize legal impact. I responded to Janet's letter with a formal rebuttal that included selected footage disproving every allegation. But I didn't just send it to Janet, I sent copies to every board member, the property management company, and the community association's insurance carrier. I wanted everyone involved to understand the level of fraud they were dealing with. The insurance company's reaction was immediate and devastating. Within 48 hours, they'd suspended the HOA's liability coverage pending investigation of the governance violations I'd documented. Without insurance, the community association couldn't legally operate, and all board authority was effectively frozen. Wednesday brought federal agents to Sunset Valley Estates. FBI Special Agent Patricia Kim arrived with a team of investigators and a warrant to seize all HOA records, computer files, and financial documents. They spent 6 hours in the community clubhouse, photographing evidence and interviewing residents about their experiences with Janet's board. Janet's response was predictably hysterical. She called an emergency community meeting for that evening, claiming that disgruntled residents were using false allegations to destroy the HOA's ability to maintain community standards. She painted herself as a victim of a vindictive campaign led by someone who wanted to circumvent legitimate animal restrictions. The meeting was packed with curious neighbors who'd watched federal agents searching the clubhouse and wanted answers. Janet stood at the front of the room in full victim mode, dabbing at her eyes with tissues while explaining how she tried to work with me but faced constant hostility and unreasonable demands. "Marcus Thompson has made it clear that he believes federal laws give him the right to ignore community standards," Janet announced to the crowd. "His emotional support animal documentation might be technically valid, but that doesn't give him the right to terrorize neighbors who have legitimate concerns about aggressive animals." I let her finish her performance before standing up to address the room. I'd brought a laptop and projector, and I asked for permission to present evidence that would clarify the situation for everyone present. What happened next was the most satisfying 20 minutes of my adult life. I played selected clips from 6 months of illegal board meetings, with Janet's voice clearly audible as she discussed plans to circumvent federal disability laws. I showed the footage of her planning to use selective enforcement to harass me into leaving the community. I played the recording where she called veterans with PTSD unstable and prone to outbursts. But the most damaging evidence was her admission that she'd fabricated the aggressive behavior reports. In one recording, Janet told Steve that they needed to create documentation of problems to justify Rex's removal, even if they had to interpret normal dog behavior as aggressive. The room was silent as residents realized they'd been living under a board that conducted illegal meetings to plan discriminatory harassment campaigns. Several neighbors immediately stood up to apologize for not speaking out against Janet's obvious targeting of my family. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down, was particularly vocal. "Janet, I watch Marcus and Rex walk past my house every day. That dog has never shown the slightest sign of aggression toward anyone. You've been lying to all of us while conducting secret meetings that violated our trust and our legal rights." Janet tried to regain control by claiming the recordings were edited or taken out of context, but the evidence was too comprehensive and damaging. One by one, community members called for her immediate resignation and demanded accountability for the financial irregularities I'd documented. The vote of no confidence was unanimous. Every resident present voted to remove Janet and her allies from the board, effective immediately. The community also voted to cooperate fully with all ongoing investigations and to implement transparent governance reforms that would prevent future abuses. Thursday brought the beginning of legal consequences. The Colorado Attorney General's office filed criminal charges against Janet Mills for conspiracy to violate civil rights, sunshine law violations, and fraud. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 5 years in federal prison and $250,000 in fines. But the civil penalties were equally devastating. HUD imposed a $500,000 fine on the HOA for disability discrimination and required the community to implement federally monitored compliance programs. The settlement also included $75,000 in personal damages to my family for the emotional distress and violation of our federal housing rights. Janet's personal liability was even worse. She faced individual civil rights lawsuits from 3 other residents who'd been targeted for discriminatory enforcement. Her homeowner's insurance refused coverage for the discrimination claims, leaving her personally responsible for hundreds of thousands in legal fees and potential judgments. Friday brought the financial investigation results. The IRS had found $180,000 in misappropriated HOA funds that Janet had directed to her brother's landscaping company and other personal benefits. She faced federal tax evasion charges in addition to the civil rights violations, and the community association demanded full restitution plus penalties. But the most satisfying consequence was watching Janet's house go up for sale. Between legal fees, federal fines, civil judgments, and tax penalties, she'd lost everything. The woman who tried to force my family out of the community was now fleeing in financial ruin. 6 months later, the transformation of Sunset Valley Estates was complete. The new board implemented policies prioritizing residents' rights over aesthetic perfectionism. They established clear procedures for accommodation requests and transparent governance that prevented future discrimination. Rex became something of a neighborhood celebrity. Residents who'd been intimidated by Janet's enforcement regime now stopped to pet him during our walks and thank him for exposing the corruption that had been poisoning their community. Children who'd been taught to fear him now played fetch in the common areas while their parents watched and smiled. The legal precedent we established helped dozens of other communities facing similar discrimination. The Colorado Attorney General's office created new oversight procedures for community associations, and several other states adopted similar protections based on our case. Dr. Woods used our case as an example in her testimony before Congress about emotional support animal protections. She noted that Rex had not only provided therapeutic support to me throughout the ordeal, but had inadvertently become a catalyst for protecting disabled residents' rights across the country. The cybersecurity skills I'd learned in the Army and developed professionally proved invaluable in a context I'd never expected. Sometimes the best defense really is having evidence nobody knows you're collecting, especially when you're dealing with people who believe their authority puts them above the law. Janet Mills served 18 months in federal prison and was permanently banned from serving on any community association board. Her conviction became a cautionary tale used by HOA management companies to train new board members about the serious legal consequences of discrimination and governance violations. Rex and I still live in Sunset Valley Estates, where he continues to provide invaluable emotional support while enjoying the respect and affection of neighbors who understand that accommodation isn't about special treatment, it's about equal access to the community we all call home. If you're dealing with HOA discrimination against your emotional support animal or any other disability accommodation, document everything, know your federal rights, and remember that sunshine laws exist to prevent exactly the kind of secret planning that Janet thought would remain hidden forever. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see more stories about communities standing up to corruption and discrimination. And remember, sometimes the most powerful weapon against abuse of authority is patience, preparation, and a really good surveillance system. Next week, I'm sharing the story of how an HOA tried to fine a deaf resident for not responding to verbal warnings, only to discover she'd been documenting their violations of ADA communication requirements for 2 years. That's a story about a different kind of evidence and how federal accessibility laws protect everyone's right to full community participation. The best communities are built on respect, accommodation, and transparency. Janet Mills learned too late that targeting people's disabilities isn't just morally wrong, it's federally illegal and personally devastating for anyone stupid enough to try it.